Hello and welcome. My name is Andrea Walford, and in this video I'm going to show you how to create this beautiful yet simple one-layer card that is perfect for beginning card makers. Now, as I mentioned, this video is for beginning card makers. So I'm going to walk you through the entire process for creating this card, including how I actually create the base for my card, which you'll hear me refer to as the card base. Along the way, I'll be sharing all sorts of different tips and tricks for how to get clear stamped images and for how to make the most of the images on the stamp set you choose to purchase. So let's walk through the supplies we're going to be using for this card. I have here an 8.5 by 11 sheet of thick white cardstock. The cardstock that I like to use is Stampin' Up's Whisper White Thick. Now I'm going to be cutting and scoring my card with this paper cutter. And then the supplies I'm going to be using to actually create my card are the ones that I have here. Now, first off, let me just draw your attention to this. These are baby wipes. They're unscented baby wipes, and this is how I like to clean my stamps. Out of all the various methods for cleaning stamps, this is my favorite when I'm using dye-based inks, which are water-based inks. So I always like to take one baby wipe out and just keep it off to the side so that it's ready to use whenever I need it. Now the stamp set that I'm going to be using is this photopolymer stamp set from Stampin' Up called Field of Flowers. Now this is a wonderful stamp set for beginning stampers and card makers because it has a whole bunch of different elements that you can mix and match for endless design options. Now as you can see, it has both images and it also has greetings. And these images are what are called solid stamp images. So you add your color through the inks that you're going to use, which again is great for beginners because you don't have to worry about coloring if you don't know how to color or you don't like coloring. The greetings, you have a nice variety. You have this beautiful script greeting, and then you have all of these regular font greetings as well. And there's a good combination, so this can cover a huge variety of occasions. Now the ink colors that I'm going to be using are as follows. I've got this Bermuda Bay, Mango Melody, Granny Apple Green, and Poppy Parade. I'm also going to be using this Memento Tuxedo Black ink, and this is the ink that I use when I'm going to be stamping the greeting onto my card. The only embellishment that I'm going to be using are some clear rhinestones. These ones are Stampin' Up's Rhinestone Basic Jewels, or can't remember exactly how they're called, but they're basic clear rhinestones with a self-adhesive backing. And these are a wonderful embellishment when you're just starting to build out your stash. You may like sequins instead, and sequins are also wonderful. Either sequins or rhinestones, I would recommend that if you're just going to buy one embellishment, those would be a good one to buy. Now I have a bone folder. I'm going to use that to get a nice crisp crease on my card, and I'll show you how to do that in just a little bit. I'm not going to use this for this card. Actually, no, I will be using this for this card, but I like to have a fine tip pair of tweezers, and these are good for picking up small things, so I'm going to use these to help me place my rhinestones. I have a pencil, and then I have a white eraser. It doesn't matter what size white eraser you use. I just like this one because it's small and fine and I can get into small areas. This is the Tombow Mono Zero eraser. I like to have a ruler that has grid marking. So usually you'll find this in the quilting section of your local craft store. It doesn't much matter what size you get. I just find that I like to use the size, it's 3 inches by 12 inches. And it has these lines at all the different measurement markings. This here is washi tape. This is just an old tape that I've had for years from my stash. You don't have to have washi tape. What you're basically looking for is some kind of a low tack adhesive. So you could use like a painter's masking tape as well if you don't have any washi tape lying around or anything like that. And I'll show you a little trick too for making tape less sticky. I'm working on a self-healing cutting mat. I like working on this surface because it's nice and firm, which helps me to get nice, crisp stamped images. And on top of that, I have a piece of grid paper. This grid paper is from Stampin' Up. It's 11 by 17. It provides a good work surface, so you'll see me using it as we create this card, and I'll explain to you why I like to use it. But I really appreciate the fact that it also has ruler markings. On one side, it's marked in inches, and on the other side, it's marked in centimeters. So that's what we're going to be using for today's card. Now, the other thing you may want to do is to go ahead and prepare your stamps on the acrylic blocks ahead of time. So I always do this when I'm creating because I find that it saves time afterwards. I don't have to fumble around looking for the right blocks. So for this card, I'm going to be using this large field grasses image, this large stem, these flowers over here, the dragonfly, and then the thinking of you sentiment. So what I've done is I've mounted them onto clear acrylic blocks. So whenever you're stamping with a photopolymer stamp set, which is a clear stamp set, you're going to need to have some acrylic blocks because otherwise you're not going to be able to stamp your image properly. Now, when you're choosing acrylic blocks, you want to make sure you choose blocks that are as close in size to your stamps as you possibly can, because that will reduce the likelihood of you accidentally getting ink smears on the block, which then transfer onto your work. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to own every block size under the sun. One of the things I love about Stampin' Up, and that's where I buy my stamps and my blocks, well, pretty much everything I buy from them just because I love their stuff so much. But they have, all their stamps are designed to fit with their acrylic blocks. So I just have one of each of their acrylic blocks, and I know I'm always going to have a block that fits the stamps that I'm using. So that's how I prepare for my card. So let's go ahead now and create the base of our card. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my cardstock piece to create my card base. I have here my paper trimmer, and it comes with two blades. It has a cutting blade, and then it has this scoring blade. And I'm just going to slide both the blades to the bottom, and then I'm going to lift up this clear plastic guide. Now, this paper trimmer has markings in inches and in centimeters. I like to work in inches, so that's the marking I'm going to keep my eye on. And what I want to do is cut my cardstock in half. So I'm going to cut it at 4 1/4 inches. Now, I want to create a top folding portrait card, and you'll see what that means once we're done. So to do that, I'm placing the short edge of my cardstock along the top of my paper trimmer, so 4 1/4 inches. That's the halfway point. If you want to create a card that opens traditionally like this, you would cut your cardstock in this direction, and you would be cutting it at 5 1/2 inches. Now, I have a post on my blog that talks about how to get the basic card folds. So I'm going to align this along the top of my paper trimmer at 4 1/4 inches. I'm going to close my guide, and I'm going to make sure that the paper is butted right up against the top of my paper trimmer, and I want the left edge of my paper to follow along all the way down that 4 1/4 inch line. I like to use my left hand to brace the paper. I'm right-handed, so it's to keep the paper steady. And then just applying a very light pressure to my blade, I'm going to push it upwards to cut my paper. Now, the reason I like to push it upwards is when you're cutting through paper, there is some resistance that's offered to the blade, even when you have a very sharp blade. If you're pulling downwards on your blade, there's always the chance that if you're not bracing your paper firmly, you can kind of shift or knock your paper out of alignment and end up with a crooked cut. So now you can see, once I've cut my paper, I have two 4 1/4 by 11 inch pieces of cardstock. So I can create 2 cards out of this. So I'm going to go ahead and set one of those pieces aside, and now I want to score my paper. So I'm going to open my guide again. This time I'm going to align it at the 5 1/2 inch mark, so the halfway point on my 11 inch paper. I'm going to close my guide again, and this time I want to use my scoring blade. Now, I always apply more pressure on my scoring blade because I really want a nice deep groove or indentation in the paper because it makes it easy to fold. So I apply a good amount of pressure, and I usually also will run it back and forth a few times. And then you can see I have my score line here. So now it's time for the bone folder. Now, I never just take my cardstock and then fold it along the score line, because if you don't align the edges, you could end up still with a crooked card. So what I'll do is I'll take both edges and I'll align them together like so. I'll hold them in place, and then I will take my bone folder and I'll slowly, I have it on an angle and I'm running it back and forth and I'm applying pressure along that line. And then I usually like to flip it over and do it on both sides. And then what that does, you can see I've got a nice, smooth, crisp fold on my card. So we now have the base of our card, which you'll hear me refer to as our card base. So it's now time to start stamping. So now we're ready to stamp on the front of our card, or the card front of the card base. So I'm going to open it up and place it on my grid paper. Notice how it doesn't sit perfectly flat. I'm going to take my washi tape and I'm going to tape it down so that it sits flat against my stamping surface. The reason I'm doing this is because if your cardstock is not flat and you stamp, it can bounce back when you remove the stamp, and it could touch your stamp, and then you could end up with ink smears where you don't want them. So to help keep it flat and also to keep it in place so it doesn't shift as I'm stamping, I use a low tack tape. Now let's say you don't have washi tape, you don't have painter's masking tape, you have another tape like Scotch tape or something like that. You can always reduce the tackiness of your tape by just placing it on your hand and removing it, and that lowers how sticky it is. And if it still feels sticky, like this doesn't feel too sticky, but if it still feels sticky, you can do that again. So I'm just going to place this at the fold line here. And you can see it's now holding my card down. Now it comes up a little bit here, but that's not too bad. And I don't want to tape here because we're going to be stamping along the bottom. Now one thing I want you to notice is that I've aligned the bottom edge of my cardstock with one of the lines on my grid paper. And that's really important because I use this as a visual reference to make sure that I am stamping straight. So the first image we're going to stamp is this large field grasses stamp, and I want to align it along the bottom. Now, one of the things that's really important when you're aligning it is that you want to make sure that it completely covers the bottom. You don't want to stamp and then still have some white space showing underneath the stamp, because then it looks like your grass is growing out of thin air. So you want to bring it downwards a little bit when you're stamping. So keep that in mind. You're going to need to look through the stamp, and that's why I recommend clear stamps for beginning stampers, because it's easy to see where you're placing them. I'm going to look through it and then make sure that I can see the edge of my cardstock above the bottom edge of the stamp. So the ink pad I'm going to be using is Granny Apple Green. To open this ink pad, you click it open, or you pull it open, and then you slide it. But I don't like to slide them all the way to the end, because I find if I have this little bit overhanging, it makes it a lot easier to then pull and close. Now, whenever my stamp is larger than the surface of my ink pad, I like to ink my ink to my stamp rather than my stamp to my ink. So I'm just going to press my ink pad up and down along my stamp. This is the best way to ink your stamp. You don't want to smoosh your ink pad, you don't want to twist it, you just want to tap it up and down against your stamp until you make sure the entire surface is covered. Now, before I go ahead and stamp, I always like to take a close look, make sure that the entire image is covered with ink and there's no little stray bits of fluff. Now I want to align it with the bottom of the card. Now, in order to do this, you're actually going to need to look straight down through the top of the stamp. You can't do this on an angle. So excuse me if my head gets in the way of the camera. I'm going to do my best to try to keep it out of the way as I look to align this. Now remember, you want to make sure that your stamp extends a little bit below the edge of your cardstock. And then when you're ready to stamp, you very gently lower your stamp, and then I hold it in place while I make sure I apply pressure all along the block. And then I just very gently lift it up, and you can see I have a perfect stamped image. Now, I always like to clean my stamp right away afterwards, because that way, if I accidentally set something aside, let's say my card has various pieces, I don't want to accidentally set it onto an inked stamp. I also, generally, if I'm done working with an ink color, will close it up, but we're still going to be using this one. So the next image that I'm going to be stamping is this stem image, and I want to stamp it twice. Now, I just rubbed my baby wipe over it because it looked like it wasn't perfectly clean. So before I actually go ahead and apply my ink, I'm just going to clean it off on my grid paper. So that's another reason I like to have my grid paper. Now, because my stamp is smaller than my ink pad, I'm going to gently tap my stamp up and down on my ink pad rather than tapping my ink pad to my stamp, because it's easier to see that my entire stamp is getting inked. Then I'm going to take a quick look to make sure my ink is even and I don't have any fluffs on it. When you're stamping, again, you don't want your stem floating in the air, so you want to make sure that it extends a little bit below the edge of the cardstock. So once again, you're going to want to look over it and look through just to make sure that it's in the right spot. And as we stamped with the field grasses, you stamp straight down and then lift straight up. Now, even though I'm going to be stamping a second image here, I want to stamp it. I don't want to stamp the entire image because it would look just very odd if I had two stems the exact same size, one beside the other. When you look at flowers in a garden, rarely are the flowers the exact same height. So I want to create some height variation. But if I slide my stamp downwards, then you'll notice that this larger leaf will be partially cut off, which looks a little odd. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a technique called masking. So I'm going to mask off part of this stamp so that I only use the parts that I want. And this is a fabulous way to extend your stamps. And this is something that I talk about on my blog when I talk about basic stamping techniques. So once again, I'm going to make sure my stamp is clean. And what I want to do is I want to mask off the area of this large leaf. So I'm going to take my tape, and this time it doesn't have to be low tack. Any tape is fine. And you do want to make sure that that entire leaf is blocked off, but at the same time, you want to make sure that it doesn't overextend onto the stem at all. So there you can see what that looks like. So now I'm going to ink this up. So you can see through the stamp how the stem and the two leaves are inked up. And then I'm going to take this tape and I'm going to carefully pull it off my stamp. And when you set it aside somewhere, make sure you set it aside somewhere where you're not going to accidentally stick your elbow into it. Now I'm going to position this stamp so it's a little bit to the right because I need to leave room for my flowers, and then down. And then I'm going to stamp straight down and straight up like so. And you can see, even though there's similarities between the two, you don't have the leaf, so it looks a little bit different. So I've now gotten two images essentially in one. So I'm done with the green ink, and I'm going to set that aside. And I'm going to work with my flower stamp. Now you can see the flower stamp is actually two different flowers on one stamp. So I'm going to start by stamping my tall flower in Poppy Parade Classic ink. So I'm going to press my stamp up and down on my Poppy Parade, and then I'm going to look through the stamp to align it on the top of my stem. So once again, I'm going to have to lean over and look on the top. And once you have it in place, you just press down and you lift up. So now the next flowers we want to stamp in yellow. So we're going to have to make sure this is super clean. So I'm cleaning it with my wipe, and then I'm stamping off. I want to make sure there's absolutely no residue. This time though, I don't want it to look exactly the same. So I'm going to be stamping two of the smaller flowers. So once again, we're going to be using this a masking technique. So I've got my washi tape, and I'm going to block off that one stamp. I'm going to be using this beautiful yellow ink, which is Mango Melody. And I'm just going to do my best to only ink that one flower stamp. But you can see why it's important to mask off the other one, because even when you're careful, you still end up with ink going over. I'm going to pull that tape off, and I'm going to save that because I can use that again, I think, anyways. And now I'm going to very carefully position this stamp at the top of that stem. And let's see. I'm going to cover this again. Now, if you're reusing tape like I'm doing here, be very careful you do not dip your fingers in that ink. So I'm just going to clean my fingers. And then I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to ink that up. Remove my tape. Set it aside somewhere where I can't accidentally dip my arm into it. And then I'm going to align my stamp with the top of the stem and stamp. And you can see I now have 2 small yellow flowers on that one. Isn't that beautiful? I just love how that looks. Okay, next step is the one that is probably the most tricky out of all of them. This is the stamping of the sentiment. And when you're freehand stamping, you have to have a steady hand for this. If you don't have a steady hand, if you don't trust yourself, because of course now if we stamp crooked or make a mistake, our whole card is ruined and we have to start over. So if you don't trust yourself to stamp straight, then you might want to consider investing in a stamp positioning tools and in a stamp positioning tool. And there are a variety of different tools that are available to choose from, and I'll talk about those in a later video and blog post. In the meantime, I'm going to freehand my greeting. Now, what I'll sometimes do is with the clear photopolymer stamps, you can see that you get this backing that has the different greetings, I guess, printed onto this acetate sheet. So what I'll sometimes do is use this to help me decide where I want my greeting stamped. And the greeting I'm going to be using is Thinking of You, and I want to stamp it right here, kind of in between this flower and the edge of the card. So I'm going to take my ruler. So this is where it's handy to have a ruler along with your grid paper. And first I'm going to align it with one of the lines just to make sure it's straight. And then I'm going to very carefully slide my ruler upwards. And then I always take a look at the bottom edge of my card in reference to the lines in my ruler too. And then with my pencil, I'm going to very lightly draw a pencil line. It has to be extremely light. You don't want to apply any pressure, otherwise you'll end up with an indentation in your cardstock and it'll be really hard to erase later. To stamp my greeting, I'm going to use my Memento Tuxedo Black ink. Now take your time when you're doing this. And in fact, if you've never used a greeting stamp before in that stamp set, so it's a brand new stamp set to you, you haven't used it, I recommend actually testing it out on your grid paper. So just use ink up your stamp and then practice pressing it down, lifting it up. And the reason you're doing this is you're getting a feel for the stamp and you're seeing how much pressure you need to get a nice crisp image. So for example, let's say you don't apply enough pressure, you see how much lighter that is and it's not as clean a stamp as that one, or you apply too much pressure and you can see you end up with a smudged image. So practice with your greeting stamps on your grid paper. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to ink my stamp, and then I'm going to once again look over the stamp. So I'm going to have to get my head over this, so I apologize in advance for getting my head in the camera, and then I'm going to carefully stamp. So once you've stamped, carefully lift up, and that's not bad. It's a teeny little bit off, but not enough when you look at it that I think anybody would notice. So probably as close to as good as you're going to get by freehanding it. Now I'm not going to erase my pencil line right away. I usually like to leave that until after I'm done all my stamping so that I don't accidentally smear my ink. Now the Memento Tuxedo Black ink is a dye-based ink, so it is a quick drying ink, but you never know. Let's say there was, I don't know, just a little bit extra ink on there. You don't want to accidentally smear it by erasing too early. So now I'm going to use my Bermuda Bay Classic ink, and I want to add a few dragonflies. So I'm inking my stamp, and then I think I'm going to stamp one here, and then I might want to stamp one down here. So I'm going to stamp one here, and then I'm going to do a technique called stamping off, or sorry, not stamping off. I can't even remember what this technique is called now. But basically I'm stamping a second time without re-inking my stamp, and you can see I get this tone-on-tone effect. I'll put the name of that technique in the blog post, but essentially, I guess it is kind of like stamping off, because you're stamping, you ink your stamp, you're stamping, and then without cleaning your stamp again, you're stamping again. So that gives you two different tones of ink from one ink pad. So it's a great way to stretch your ink colors. Now I could potentially add a third dragonfly, although I'm not really sure if I want to. So something that I sometimes do if I'm trying to decide whether I would like something. So this is just a little quick tip for you. Let's say I'm trying to decide whether I want to add an element to my card or not. I'll take a scrap piece of paper and I will stamp my image on it, and then I will take a fine tip pair of scissors and I will just very roughly cut out that image. Not worrying too much about whether all the edges are even or if it's perfect or whatever. And then I'll place it on my card to see if I like how it looks. See, now when I have it there and I look at it, I think, yeah, I don't know, that doesn't look quite right. It looks a little bit too close there, or a little bit too scattered. So then I might move it up there to see if perhaps I like it up there. And I actually don't mind that. So I'm going to ink up my stamp now that I've decided that I do like it in that position. And I'm going to stamp. See, had I just gone ahead and thought maybe I wanted it here and stamped it, I would have stamped it, then I wouldn't have liked it. So now we're ready to get rid of our pencil line. So I'm going to take my eraser here, and I'm going to very carefully and gently erase that pencil line. And then usually when I'm getting rid of that kind of eraser residue, I like to use some kind of a paintbrush or soft bristled brush to just brush it off rather than my fingers. Because if you have any ink on your fingers, the oils of your fingers, any of that, you can cause smears or imprints on your card. So now let's get rid of this tape here. We don't need that anymore. And then my very last step is to add a little sparkle. Now you could leave it like this if you don't have any rhinestones or sequins or anything to put on it. You could simply leave it like this. But I always love adding a touch of sparkle to my cards. So what I'm going to do, you can see I'm using my tweezers, and I'm going to put one little rhinestone on top of this big flower here. Now, quick tip for you, when you're adding rhinestones or sequins or whatever in your card, if it's a self-adhesive one, so one that has an adhesive backing, don't push it right down on your card, because you can see here I can still nudge this around if I decide that I don't like exactly where I've placed it. Once you stick it down, you run the risk of ripping your cardstock. So I'm thinking I want one there. I want one there. I might take a medium-sized one. Might put it there. I find for me, usually the part of my card that takes the most time is trying to decide where I want my rhinestones. Now I sit here and I fiddle with them and I fiddle with them. See, I feel like that one's too big. Now you don't want to get caught up in overthinking where you're going to put things, but once you're kind of happy with the placement, I think, you know what, I just feel like it needs one more. I'm going to put one more kind of up here. And once you're happy with the placement, then you can go ahead and press them down. And there you go. You can see we finished this quick, easy, simple beautiful one-layer card. Well, I hope you found this tutorial helpful and that you've gotten a lot of useful tips to help you along in your stamping and card making journey.